Welcome back, everyone, to Tarot Journeys with Guy. How's everybody doing today? Hope you're doing well on this fine morning, fine evening, depending on when you're watching and where you are in the world. Now, today what we're going to do is we're going to continue on the tarot lesson that I begun. So if you haven't begun watching those videos, make sure you go and check those out. There's 3, and we started with doing a little spread and sort of explaining a little bit the nature of the cards, but also showing what the cards can be used for. And then we moved on and I described this hidden history of the tarot through the Fool card and continued on to the Magician, which described to us the lesser mystery of the major arcana. Now, the lesser arcana and the major arcana, those are the 2 divisions of the tarot cards. The lesser arcana represents regular everyday occurrences, whereas the major arcana represent archetypical energy, major life lessons, major passages that we move through. And so the cards were sort of devised that way to kind of delineate certain areas of the spiritual lesson. So with the Magician and the description within the Magician, we got this kind of understanding that there is this hidden story and that there is this sort of preparation or a beginning, okay, that needs to take place for us to enter further into what the ancient world called the mysteries. And that leads us to the High Priestess. So the High Priestess represents the major arcana or the greater mystery. Now, one thing that this card represents is the amalgamation or the bringing together of all of the different mystery cults that came out of antiquity into the Renaissance and into our time. Now, there hasn't been a lot written about the mysteries and the mystery cults and the rituals that revolved around them. Part of the initiation into the greater mysteries was secrecy. And to divulge those secrets, you would be subject to death. And so there's a famous story of Socrates. Plato retells the story of Socrates and Socrates' demise as a heretic, as divulging some of those secrets. And so throughout the ages, there's been people that have written segments of it. And that's kind of what we get with this card here, is that in some ways, she represents the mystery schools and how this esoteric knowledge was brought to us through them. One of the things that this card sort of leads us to sort of suspect, especially when we start talking about the mysteries, is the mysteries of the Eleusinian rites from ancient Greek. And the initiation that came from that were heralded in the ancient world as the most prominent of the sacred teachings of the sacred rites. And that people that went through this had been transformed and came out with a very high moral character. And so there's a profound purity that is associated with the mystery of Eleusis. Part of that whole ritual, especially in ancient Greek, now this goes back to the Minoan and the Mycenaean culture, the early formations of Europe, which there's really not much known. Back to 1200 BC, there's accounts of the ritual of Eleusis and the initiation of Eleusis coming around 600 BC. Eleusis is a town about 20 kilometers from Athens. And so what would happen? Every year, there would be a public festival around in the autumn time that was timed with their growing season in the beginning of the new season, okay? And so the public rites were part of that initiation, were part of the lesser mysteries. In that celebration, there was also a purification ritual that took place, okay? And so that's what we kind of illustrated or pointed out with the Magician card. That was a prerequisite to enter into the greater mystery. Okay, and so that's what we saw. There was a purification rite and a celebration and a progression and a pilgrimage from Athens to Eleusis, the cult center of Eleusis. Okay, now simultaneously or alongside of that, there's been other cults, right? There's another cult there, that the Bacchic cults or the Dionysic cults, which are very different from this. Okay, and this also sort of illustrates and shows us the division of the mystery schools. Now, the Bacchic rites and the Dionysic rites were really associated with the mass orgies and like what we see like fulfilled today, actually, and what some of these elitist groups and these some of the left-hand path of the mystery schools still perform, like very famous pictures of the Rothschilds parties in the 70s, of them dressing up in bacchanalic, Saturnalia sort of wardrobe. The movie Eyes Wide Shut also illustrates this, right? So there's a clear difference, and in fact, within the mystery school teachings, that they definitely, that's one thing that had been delineated to the students of the mysteries. Okay, so this kind of talks about that right-hand path, that path that was there to sort of benefit humanity, and that's what they claimed with the Eleusinian initiation. What we see in this card is kind of an allusion towards this, but what is really sort of obvious is we've got the High Priestess sitting at the entrance of a temple, and that temple being King Solomon's temple, with the two pillars of Boaz and Jacinth, leading us to old reliefs and what we know of the Temple of Thebes in Egypt, okay, which was also a very prominent cult center and a center of the priesthood, okay? And so she represents that sort of that priesthood and that lineage, okay? So in like with the Temple of Thebes, we got the two pillars here that look like lotus flowers, okay? And that's kind of where we start to sort of see the representation there. Same with the writings in the Bible around King Solomon's temple. Now, the temple, King Solomon's temple, was very symbolic and very prominent in the ancient world. That was something, especially in the Western Christian culture, was looked upon as an ideal to sort of excel towards, okay? But what we have here is this amalgamation of all these different sort of understandings. Now, in the middle 1400s, when these cards started to get developed and leading into the 1500s, this was the Renaissance. And a lot of this kind of knowledge was coming back within the elite groups, within these elitist groups, within the aristocracy, in the learned circles. Some of this knowledge was sort of kept under wraps because of the Catholic Church and it deeming anything that stood outside of Catholic orthodoxy, like of the Catholic mainstream, as heretical and treasonous, okay? So a lot of this had to be kept kind of secret. And so around that time, with the woodblock pressings of images, okay, the playing cards and different types of playing cards started to come out, and they kind of are connected with dice and games like chess and things that started to come out of the Levant, out of the Palestine, Middle Eastern area after the Crusades in the 11 and 1200s. This is one of the things that scholars and people who have studied this have speculated on, was that part of the roots of the tarot cards, one of them being with the playing cards, but also with a card game that was really prominent in northern and in middle Italy, like in Florence and in Milan, and it was called Tarucci. Very similar to bridge, and this is where we get the term trump cards, okay? But this was a card game that the rich people would sit around and play, right? And this is one of the things, one of the speculations, that in some ways, some of this esoteric lore around the mystery schools, around we just talked about, was kind of being coded in the cards. It's like hiding it in plain sight. Okay, and this is, it's a pretty educated speculation, because it kind of, when we start to sort of look at the succession of the cards, we start to see some of these ideas kind of being layered on. And by the time it got to us, in our time period, it definitely had been sort of layered and encoded. And that's what we see with A.E. Waite's cards. And also like with the Crowley deck, in showing how the cards expressed this amalgamation of the ancient system, okay? And that was kind of a thing. It was like they had to speak in codes. They had to speak, and they had to transmit this information in a way that it could continue, but it was hidden from the eyes of the wrong people, and that the people that were initiated would see, okay? And in some ways, and this is where the speculation comes in, is that the cards, when they were encoded with this Hermetic, Kabbalistic, esoteric Christian viewpoints, astrology, numerology, alchemy, ideas from the pagan world around the mystery schools, all of that was put into the cards from the position of benefiting humanity, of releasing it, of revealing it. See, and that's a part of it. That's a part of what Christianity, and the positive parts of Christianity had brought to the world, was that it was a revelation. This was a revealed religion, that it supposedly kept no secrets. So part of the spiritual truth that's transmitted there also propelled people to find deeper truth and deeper meaning, right? And they realized that what we consider a revealed religion, actually had an esoteric component. There is a hidden part of it. And part of this is this long, long story. Okay. In the 1400s, in the leading up into the 1500s, you have to kind of put yourself in that mindset where, especially if you were part of the intelligentsia, you were schooled in some way, surrounded by this kind of this knowledge, and you knew history. A big thing in the Renaissance is that human culture, like Western culture, had already gone through a long succession of calamities. One of them was the Black Plague in the 1350s on upward. And it still was a reoccurring circumstance in the mid 1400s, even up into the 1500s. Okay. And that had a huge impact on people. That in some ways, it was like, especially in the Christian world, they deemed it as like the sins of corruption had kind of played back on the Western world. The Renaissance period was this first moving away from that type of calamity where people didn't necessarily see their lives as being, an apocalypse, essentially like the end times, okay? That there was kind of a new hope. And that reestablishing this knowledge with the classical world, with the world of antiquity, was sort of there to restore that, okay? So that was one thing. That was a big thing that played on people's minds. And then the other part of it was watching the Catholic Church in the 1200s, middle 1200s, forming the Inquisition and going after heresy and deeming their own people as heretics. Okay, and like I mentioned, the Albigensian Crusade and the genocide, there was also the Crusades against the Northern European people in Poland, parts of Russia, Scandinavia. In the 1450s, in that era, they witnessed how the church transformed the definition of heresy and a heretic from these Gnostic and pagan sort of ideas to witches, and the idea of their own people being sort of in secret league with the devil. They witnessed this. and witnessed how some of this knowledge had been utilized by the Catholic Church as a tactic of fear and turning it against their own people. They had witnessed this. This was something that especially like within the mystery schools, they recognized and had to secure knowledge in the best way that they could. This was one of the possible ways that they did it. They hid this knowledge in plain sight. The playing cards and this kind of idea of the tarot started to kind of fly and move throughout Europe. And it took hundreds of years for it to sort of become prominent, like how we see today, right? And we're entering into another phase of it. So that in a way that kind of allows us to sort of see why these cards were encoded in the way that they were. So on the front of this one is very, this Judaic-Christian sort of standpoint. And in fact, this High Priestess in some ways can be sort of associated with Mary. And the idea and some of the apocryphal stories around Mary's upbringing and how she was a temple virgin, a temple priestess. Okay. And that kind of brings us to her whole robe and her wardrobe, where the blue represents and a lot of the times is representative of the sky and the Queen of Heaven. Okay, and giving Mary that name, the Queen of Heaven, leads us in the direction of going back into the ancient world, where all of the goddesses, all of the major goddesses, were given this title. And in fact, Isis was deemed as the Queen of Heaven. And in fact, in ancient Sumeria, Inanna was deemed the Queen of Heaven. And it goes in the same in the Greek world. But that lineage going back into ancient antiquity is that's what the important part of it is. So we've got this figure, the High Priestess, and she's sitting with a triple crown, which on one view of it is the moon. It's new moon, full moon, to new moon again. The maiden, the mother, and the crone. Okay, that idea of the moon going through its entire cycle. But then there's this other thing where in the ancient world, the royalty were given crowns of horns that were symbolic of the helical rising, or the morning rising of Venus, and how she would rise up. And if you traced it out through the whole cycle, would trace out a horn on one side of the sky, come around the other side, and trace out a horn on the other. Mercury would subtly do this. And the crowning of kings and queens and princes would be done on the morning rising, the helical rising of Venus. And so in some ways, that's what that indicates. And so when you study the cards and people talk about this, how the moon sits at her feet. And in some ways, this does represent the moon, okay? In the ancient system, like how the magician represented the sun, the High Priestess represents the moon, and it was the system of this diurnal system, this astrological system based around recognizing the signs and the planets through their day sign and their night sign, their sun sign and their lunar sign. That's one thing, right? We get into this thing of like the lunar symbols here, but this is also a symbol of Venus. It's a hidden symbol of Venus. When you look at Venus in a telescope and at the helical rising, that's what she looks like. It's like a thin crescent. So we've got the Temple of Solomon, Temple of Thebes, and she's the veiled Isis, okay? This idea of Isis being one of the originating goddesses, okay? And the veil that kind of covers the porch of the temple has two images on. One is pomegranates and the other is a palm tree or a tamarisk tree. Okay, and these are two very prominent symbols. One, the pomegranate, is a symbol for Persephone or Kore, and the other is of Demeter or Isis. Now, the Persephone one goes to the Greek world, but the tamarisk tree and the palm tree has a deep, deep significance. But this is also part of the story of Isis and Osiris. Now, the ancient Greeks talked about this. Herodotus talked a lot about this, where everything that in Greek religion comes from ancient Egypt. Okay, and that's what this is kind of talking about, how the goddesses were all actually conceived of as one goddess, the mother of the gods. Okay, and in fact, that's kind of one of the titles that Isis is given, is also mother of the gods, but also the goddess with the 10,000 names. This was another sort of understanding that the initiates kind of understood, that the public view of, and back in the ancient world, in the polytheistic world where they sort of believed in many, many different gods, the initiates kind of understood, and that was part of the initiation, was that in truth, underneath of it is the prime mover, the prime architect, the supreme consciousness of all, that is all things that can't truly be expressed. That is what is underneath of it, and that all of the different gods express aspects of that one divine source, and that the public view needs to be sort of in place for people to sort of come to a greater understanding so that they can sort of release that. That's one thing. And Plutarch, 2nd century AD, Greek, Roman, wrote a lot about that. He wrote actually one of the definitive stories from the ancient world around Isis and Osiris. Okay, but yet this continuation of this goddess tradition, this is also where this knowledge had been housed and had been passed on. And this is one of the things that the cards kind of express. So what we have here is this amalgamation of the goddess, right? She represents the cosmic kind of aspect of the astrological wheel as well, where what we kind of described with the magician was the solar year, okay? She describes the great cosmic year, okay, or the Platonic year, whereas the temple itself being positioned in the situation where she is facing the east, let's say, okay? On one side sits the pillar of dark, pillar of light, Boaz and Jasmine. Now, in ancient Hebrew, Boaz means strength, or to be strong, or to even quicken. And Jachnith means he establishes, or he establishes in mercy. And so interestingly enough, from dark to light, from the winter solstice to the summer solstice, and in between, due east, is the equinoxes. Okay, and so in some ways that sort of gives us a larger perspective of cosmic time. The solar cross sits on her chest, and the solar cross, being a very, very ancient symbol, way older than Christianity, okay, has this allegory that not only is significant to us recognizing the cosmos, but also is significant to our earthly existence, okay? But yet this solar cross sits on her chest is the idea of the movement of the sun over a long period of time. And in fact, how to track that properly, you need a good measure of the moon, the sun with the equinoxes and the solstices, and Venus. With that, over a long, long period of time, you can start to recognize how there is this slow shift backwards, this apparent shift backwards in the zodiac. This is what gives us this understanding of the astrological ages and the idea of this knowledge coming from the golden age and us moving into a dark age and coming out of it. And this is kind of what this talks about. The story of Isis and Osiris is what one of the underpinnings of the Eleusinian mysteries are. The other kind of mystery schools that came about in like 1st century AD, 2nd century AD, the mysteries of Mithra. Okay, and that's another really prominent one. And so what they're trying to sort of show us is that how everything is kind of, there's this syncretic or an amalgamation of this tradition that we have inherited as far as Western culture goes, and that it goes back far, far, far deep. And if you go and look at the story of Osiris and Isis, you can see a parallel, and you can see parallels within all of what I've mentioned, and you can see it being played out in a Christian context. So what sits on her lap is the secret doctrine, okay, or what some have deemed as the secret doctrine. And if you look closely, there's T-O-R-A spelt out. And that quite literally can be the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament or the Jewish Bible. The H is hidden, or is it a T? This could be the tarot reversed. Okay, and that's kind of like what we're sort of getting at, is that the tarot in one way comes from an understanding from all of these different philosophies and worldviews and spiritual understandings, okay? So it's this idea, is this amalgamation, and getting people to realize that there is this continuation and even beyond what we recognize as like beginnings or some of the origins, okay? So in some ways, this is Mary, Jesus's mom, and how they put that symbol onto her, and in some ways, like, she is also responsible for bringing forth some of this knowledge in the Apocryphon of James, which talks about her upbringing, but also early years of Jesus, where she is what helped bring Jesus that knowledge. But it's this idea that the initiation continues on, and that Jesus was part of that initiatory chain. Same with Mary. So I put out the cards here, and it shows you the progression, okay? What's interesting here, La Papesse, the female pope, okay, is kind of is an interesting Middle Ages legend. Talks about Pope Joan, a legendary or a mythical pope in the 9th century who disguised herself as a man and became a priest and a cardinal and all the way to the Pope. And there was this controversy and was caught. And so there's this part of this legendary idea that underneath of it is this goddess tradition, that the feminine part of religion plays a very important part. Now, and that's kind of part of it. And then the other one here with the later cards is kind of got this Fijian looking character, Junon. This is the consort of Juno, which is the Latin Romanized name for Zeus. And so this would be Hera. And Hera being one of the goddesses, right? And so it's kind of this idea of like the goddess being sort of one of the symbols of this card, okay? One of the last things too you see here, a lot of times people talk about how this is the tree of life. These could be like the 10 Sephiroth of the tree of life, and that these two pillars are the outside pillars of the tree, where she is the inner pillar, okay? That's another part of it. And then what we've got here is this sort of symbol of the tamarisk tree, which is a very prominent symbol that has been carried over, where the palm tree, like Jesus in his return to Jerusalem is carrying a palm. It's like a symbol of victory, peace, and fulfillment. Okay, and so it's very prominent in that story of Isis and Osiris, where she finds the body of Osiris inlaid in a beam, in a great beam, in one of a Phoenician king's palace. And this whole story, how Osiris and Isis came into being, and his death, and her reclaiming his body and his resurrection. But it's this idea of the death of the old god and the rebirth and the regeneration of the new God. That's in every ancient doctrine and philosophy. This is maybe one of the things that they were taught in these mystery schools. Now, part of the greater mystery is they would have to go through these trials and hardships, but these were preparations not only to live a better life, but also for the spiritual life, for the afterlife, which over long periods of time had been developed. Okay. And that's kind of what this story of Osiris talks about. Okay. And that's one of the hidden secrets that has been revealed to us over time, is that they perform this ritual of bringing a person close to death and then revitalizing them. And they would go through like a second birth to live a second life. That second life would be not only to live in a high moral character and to provide for their community, but it was also a preparation for the next life, the afterlife. And that's another one of those hidden traditions. You can really see the shift in the cards. Okay, you can really, and the more we look at it, you'll really see how certain symbols remain kind of prevalent, but yet they have shifted. Wow, that's a lot of information. It blows my mind. As soon as I start talking about it, I am like, wow. And that's part of it. It's like a lot of what I'm talking about can be referenced and researched. There's tons of information out there. It's not just coming from me. We can speculate on the researches that have been done for hundreds of years. Okay, so just to finish it off, we're gonna do continuation of the card spreads. And so what we did last one was 5, the number 5, working off of the 5 naked eye planets. And so today what we're going to do is a 6-card spread, and we're going to incorporate the sort of the astrological understanding of the 3, but we're going to apply it to the 2 aspects, the solar and the lunar, the masculine and the feminine, the active, the inactive, the various ways to sort of look at the 2 sides of things, right? And so this is kind of like one of those spreads where it can be good for relationships. You can look at 2 different people at once, 2 prevailing ideas, that kind of sort of understanding. It's kind of a card spread to find a synthesis, to find how things come together. Okay. And so like last time, this is more for learning. This is guidance for us as initiates, as students on the path. What is going to help us in our studies? What's going to help us in sort of understanding some of this stuff clearer? And what kind of guidance do we need to hear? It's going to help us continue on. Now, when you put those 2 triangles together, you get the Solomon's seal, or the Star of David. The masculine and the feminine finding unity. Okay? This card spread is more about bringing balance. Okay? Quite simply. And a lot of the times what I would do is if I were to pull this card spread, I would do a 7th card. But that's for later, because you could do like a Star of David, or let's say what is outward and what is inward. Let's just put it that way. So outwardly, what are we excelling towards? What is drawing us upwards, right? And this, where the cup is open, what are we being filled with? What is being downloaded into us? Now, one thing in astrology that you can sort of apply to these cards is this idea of like cardinal, fixed, mutable. Okay, so this is the card that gives us direction and sort of helps us understand where things are moving. This is the card that gives us structure, and this is the card that sort of moves between the 2. This is what helps us move into the next sign, let's say. But see, this is what we can read that in a very specific way, whereas like the cardinal position here, and so what is inward, what is the inner message, and what are we being sort of directed outwardly to do? Okay, so the inward message is to clear ideas, clear anything like what we're talking about is like clearing away that which doesn't allow our energy to rise. So a lot of the times it has a lot to do with belief systems. Clearing that actively within ourselves, so seeking in meditation and sort of being able to sort of observe mental patterns and how that can also lead us to making better choices that can affect like the physical body in a positive way, right? But it's more about drawing up inspiration, drawing up the energy so that you can sort of approach the world and with a clearer mind and going out into the world. And Seven of Cups reversed really has a lot to do with knowing what you want, seeing clearly, cutting away the fog, cutting away all of this, all the lies and the things that no longer serve us, right? That's super important, right? So, and then, okay, so within the structure of this, right? Fundamentally, our belief system is being shifted within us, like culturally and individually. This is kind of what the Hierophant talks about. The Hierophant represents the Pope. It's this idea that he is the vicar of Christ. He's the in-between you and God. So in the tarot, we understand that that's not necessarily the case, right? But yet it's a recognition of hierarchy. It's a recognition of a need of structure. But see, this is the thing. It's like to access this personal sort of spirituality, we don't need an infrastructure. We don't need somebody telling us, do this, do that. In fact, what we got to do is trust our own intuition. We have to really, and so the belief pattern around dogmatic religion doesn't allow for a person's individual growth, freedom, and intuition to come forward. And that has to be recognized, right? How is greater change affected? Well, it happens first within. How we see the world, how we go out into the world and express some of this stuff. Change is first within us, right? So our structure in our world is being shifted, and it has a lot to do with this inner shift that has been taking place. And the movement and how it works, the movement between these two and sort of a greater sense of well-being and fulfillment, and through family and through connections like that, but yet finding first that sense of home and contentment within ourselves. That's what helps restore and helps us kind of create a new motion like this. So we're building something new, man. Like that's something that we have to kind of sort of recognize. Part of this waking up thing that we talk about, the Great Awakening, is this initiation. Humanity is being initiated and has been for a very long time. It's been put through the process of this. And that's what this kind of talks about, is that when you achieve this sense of contentment within you without reliance on outside of yourself, regardless of what happens, that inner resolve is unshooken, that's when you have achieved the ability to sort of move out into the world with some of these understandings. And so first, the work has to be done within you, of drawing up the energy, of dealing with, like, having a free flow of energy, and ridding yourself of false belief patterns and belief patterns that no longer serve. And the only way to sort of understand that is to strike a firm relationship with you and Source, and that's it. And it's between you and divinity, and that's it. And you walk your path. That's what's going to help us clear away the illusions that we see before us, because many of us, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at the world and going, holy cow, this is what our world is now. We have to clear this in some way, shape, or form. And that's what the cards were devised to help us with. I hope that was clear. I hope everybody got some information. Now look up some of this stuff, pull out your books, go look up online some of the key points and some of the names that I mentioned. So wherever you are, please take care. I hope you have a wonderful day. Make sure you hit the subscribe button and leave a like, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.